You've mentioned a couple instances where they certain people sort of brought you up short and made you realize that you were seeing something through a lens of privilege. Or,
well, I remember the most
other
striking example of that was that it's amazing how little you know sometimes about stuff. When we had all the fellows together in the 1980s, late 80s, I had said that the whole model of California Tomorrow was that everybody came in there and took off their, this was literally the language, took off their T-shirts that said white, black, Hispanic, Asian, American, whatever. And then we all worked together. And Bruce Kelly had kind of gone along with that too. And so the fellows basically convened a meeting to tell off Bruce Kelly and me and said, you know, that's not only impossible, but it's wrong. You know, every day we walk on the street, we're black or Asian or something, we can't take off any T-shirt. And by the way, in here, we don't want to take it off. We want to all work together on these issues. But we are who we are, which is an African American, Asian American, and so on. And then I said, well, it was interesting that I was an Irish American, but somewhere along the line they dropped the slash, and the Irish just became Americans. And they said, well, that's fine. That only took a couple of 100 years, you know. So.
But perhaps you still had this identity, which isn't really recognized as a white American or a.
Well, yeah, but the identity was sort of the dominant identity, and so you know, white Americans don't refer to themselves as white Americans.
It's not acknowledged.
You know, and that was when we started talking about getting rid of the word minority, and so this reference to white boy was kind of a sort of happy way of calling me what I was,
right.
But in a very friendly fashion.
So it seems like, you know, it was a process of education for you also.
It was a great process of education, and it was a great process of education for other members of the board. I mentioned about Ugo, you know, I mean, Ugo had grown up in a system where white boys were not your friends. I mean, you knew them at Harvard and you did all of that, but they were in another world, especially if they had money and you were a farm worker kid.
Yeah.
And gradually, you know, that all began to sort of never disappears, but it would just sort of settle down in some way where with Ugo, he ceased to be a Latino and a farm worker, and I ceased to be kind of a white boy. We were just great friends that came from different places and did different things and looked different. I mean, I was a lot taller for one thing. He was a lot smarter. Anyway, it was that kind of thing. So the distinctions were always there, and you know, and I'd go up and spend time with Ugo's family, and his father came from a hat-making village in the state of Oaxaca, and so one time I went up there, and his father had had the village make a hat for me that said Lou on the front.
Oh,
you know, it was just a lot of wonderful stuff. And as I mentioned before, when we would have these weddings, that's when you'd really see how wonderful it was, because people would come to the wedding that hadn't been part of California Tomorrow, and they couldn't believe what was going on, especially when Eddie Chang, and we have this 2 black ministers and 2 Chinese bride and groom. I mean, the whole thing was just too good. So that was kind of the way things, when we started, it was an effort to make all of that work, and they were educating me and trying to do all of that. After the first 10 years, I think it was a subject that just kind of didn't come up. We were all, by that time, all kind of learned.
Yeah.